Welcome to Algebra 1, Chapter 5, Section 3, Slope-Intercept Form. This may be a bit confusing now, but as we go on through this chapter, it will become clear. A family of functions is a group of functions with a common characteristic or characteristics. A parent function is the simplest function with these common characteristics. A linear family of functions is a group of functions whose graph are a line. One way to write the equation of a linear function is using the slope-intercept form. You're going to become very familiar with that. The slope-intercept form comes in the form of y equals mx plus b, where m is your slope and b is your y-intercept. Now by y-intercept, that means where the graph crosses the y-axis. Now there are three ways to graph. One way is the table. The second way is to use your intercepts, your y-intercept and your x-intercepts. And the third way is to use the slope-intercept form. The slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b, where the slope of the line is m and the y-intercept is b. Now remember, slope is rise over run, and your y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis. So go ahead and use those words, slope, y-intercept, and slope-intercept form to complete the diagram at the right. Okay, how'd you do? Let's go on to the next one. If we want to write the equation of a line with slope of 3/2 and y-intercept of -1, we can simply place that into our equation in the correct boxes to determine the equation. So slope, remember slope is m, so m is 3/2. Y-intercept, that's our b value, that's -1. So our slope-intercept form of this equation is y equals 3/2 x, plus and a minus make a minus, so it's -1. Taking one more look at this, we need to realize that m is always the slope and b is always the y-intercept. The slope is always going to be rise over run, and the y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis. Quick look at the following examples, and of these equations we want to find the slope and the y-intercept. Looking at the first one, what number is in front of the x? That's a -1, so our slope is -1. Our y-intercept, represented by b, is the constant. In this case, it's a 3. Looking at the second one, we see that it's really not in the traditional format of y equals mx plus b, so we need to change that. In this case, m is going to equal -0.1, and our b will be 3, because again, the number in front of the x is a -0.1. In our last example, again, we need to change it. So I'm going to add 5x to both sides. So y equals positive 5x plus 0, or y equals 5x. So our m is the number in front of the x, that's 5. Our b is what's left over. Well, that's 0. There's nothing here. So that's 0. So it'll cross the y-axis at the origin. 3 here. And we're going to look at the graph at the right. And we want to know, what do you expect the slope of the line to be looking at that? Now, just generically, what do you expect it to be? Well, if you remember from a couple of videos back, the slope that moves downwards from left to right is a negative slope because it moves downward from left to right. Now, if we choose 2 points to find the slope of the line, we would look at any 2 easy to pick points. So you want any point here where it crosses these 2 little lines, so they're easy to pick. So you could look at points, let's say this one, which is point 1, 1, and let's say this one, which is point 2, 0. And using that, we can find the slope of the line. Remember, slope, y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. And so you see the slope is a -1. And we can use this graph to also find the y-intercept. Well, the y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis. And you see here it crosses, the y-intercept is 2. Now once I have my slope and my y-intercept, I can determine the slope-intercept form of the equation. Y equals mx plus b. So y equals, my m is this -1 from here, x plus my b from here. Does the equation of the line depend on the points used to find the slope? The answer would be no, because slope is consistent throughout a straight line. You have seen that if we have a graph, we can create the equation for the line on the graph. Well, I'm here to tell you that if we're given 2 points, we can also create an equation for the line that crosses through those 2 points. And the first thing we need to do, given 2 points, is to find the slope, which we will use y sub 2 minus y sub 1 over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. And you will see we have a slope of 1/2. So we've determined our slope. Now we need to determine our b, our y-intercept. To do that, we're going to pick one of the points, and it doesn't matter which point we pick. And we will put, in place of the y coordinate, use our slope. In place of the x, put the x coordinate. And then, of course, we'll have the b as our unknown, which we'll find. So we have -3 equals 1/2 plus b. Subtract 1/2 from both sides, and you'll get -3 and 1/2 equals b. Well, remember our equation is y equals our slope, which we know is 1/2, times x plus our b. Well, in this case, our b is -3 and 1/2. So our equation is y equals 1/2 x minus 3/2. And that's the equation of our line that goes through these 2 points. So problem 5, graphing a linear equation. Given a linear equation, we can create the graph for it. In this case, we know our slope is -3 and our y-intercept is 4. So we know it crosses the graph at 4. Well, if it crosses the graph at 4, we know the point it crosses is x equals 0, y is 4. That's what intercept means. So from that, we can use our slope to find another point on the line. Remember, slope is rise over run. So our slope is -3 over 1, because I had to turn that -3 into a fraction. So I'm going to rise -3, 1, 2, 3, and I'm going to run 1. And that's going to give me a second point. And actually, if I want a third point, I'm going to do the same thing again. Rise a -3 and run 1. That gives me a third point. And I can go on and on and on. I could also use 3 over -1, because that equals -3 as well. So I could rise 3 and go left 1, but that would be off my graph. So you can see that I've used the slope -3 to find multiple points. And then I simply need to draw a straight line. Steps to graphing a linear line. Step 1, use the equation to identify the slope. Step 2, use the equation to identify the y-intercept and then graph it, realizing that's going to be the point 0 and then whatever b is. And then start at the y-intercept and graph the points using the slope as a rise over run fraction. The slope-intercept form to graph a line is pretty straightforward. The first step is to recognize your b. Looking at this equation, our b, our y-intercept, is 4, which means we will put a point at 0, 4. That's where it crosses the y-axis. Now we need to recognize that our slope is 2. As a fraction, that would be 2 over 1, or -2 over -1. We can use either one. Going from our intercept, we are going to rise 2 and run 1, and that will give us a second point. Now we ran out of graph, but I always like to do a few more points than what I have. So I'm going to use the second version of our slope and go -2, -1, and give myself another point. You know what? I might do that a couple times just to make sure I have a nice straight line. And then, of course, you draw your line. Have another quick graph, and you will see that our y-intercept is a -1. So we're going to plot a point at 0, -1. And you will see our slope, that's that number in front of the x, is 2/3, which means it could also be a -2 over -3. Now it's already in fraction form, so we don't have to go there. So our rise is 2, and our run is 3. And there's our second point. And our rise is 2, and our run is 3. And there's our third point. And we could go ahead and stop there, but we could also add more points if we wish. And so here is our line. Lesson check. Please go through it. And if you had any questions over this video, make sure you bring them with you to class tomorrow.